Hi, I'm John Becker, Madison County Chairman of the Board of Supervisors. With me today is Eric Feist, Madison County Corporate Compliance Officer. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to Madison County's Corporate Compliance Program.
This video will help you to understand your roles and responsibilities toward our Corporate Compliance Program. Every employee's participation is essential towards the effectiveness of our compliance program. At the end of the video, you will be provided contact information so that you can also let us know if there are any issues regarding our corporate compliance effectiveness that you want to bring to our attention.
Both the administration and Madison County Board of Supervisors are fully committed to the laws and regulations that govern the programs and services that Madison County government is responsible for. It is our overall compliance program that helps us ensure high-quality services are provided with integrity and complete alignment with all of our legal requirements. Thank you for your participation. Together, we can ensure the most effective and efficient Madison County government.
The purpose of this session is to provide you with an understanding of the regulatory environment in which the county operates, to provide an overview of corporate compliance, and an introduction to the required elements of our corporate compliance program. There are many federal and state laws and regulations that must be adhered to, such as employment and discrimination, governance, licensing and certification, protection from abuse, health and safety, physical environment, service provision, and billing and reimbursement.
There are a multitude of federal and state laws that are applicable to any organization. Some are very general, like labor and employment laws, confidentiality, safety, and some are very specific to a certain type of program or a type of service. To complicate matters, there are some federal statutes that are more stringent than state statutes and vice versa. It's a daunting task for any organization to stay abreast of all of the federal and state requirements and the most recent interpretations of those.
So that we can be assured that we are complying with all laws and regulations, the county has developed policies and procedures and standards of practice. As a county, we are obligated to make sure that we comply with all applicable laws and regulations. In order to do this, we have implemented policies and procedures and guidelines for employees to follow. It is also our responsibility to make sure that these policies and procedures and standards of practice are being followed. Many of the services that the county provides are billed to Medicaid, Medicare, other governmental programs, and third-party payers. In addition to the healthcare programs operated by the county also receives funding from other sources to provide services and operate programs of many types. To understand the current regulatory environment, you need to be aware of some important legislative actions that relate to the detection and prevention of fraud, waste, and abuse in healthcare and other programs funded by the state and federal governments. The False Claims Act, a very old law that was enacted during the Civil War to combat fraud in government contracts, prohibits persons or businesses from improperly receiving governmental funding for goods or services and from abusing or wasting governmental funds. It is a very general law that prohibits any individual or entity from submitting false claims to the government. It also prohibits individuals or businesses from making a false statement in order to receive funds. Although it applies to any program or service reimbursed by the federal government, it has been successfully applied to healthcare and used as a means to prosecute for false Medicaid or Medicare claims. This law was updated in 1986 and again in 2009.
As an employee, you must understand that it is a crime to knowingly cause a false claim to be submitted. It is also a crime to falsify records that result in the submission of a false claim to the government. Just as it is a crime to submit a false claim, it is also a crime to falsify records, submit false reports, or conceal information to avoid paying an obligation to the government.
The term knowingly is used throughout the False Claims Act. The government defines knowingly as either you knew or should have known. A person who has actual knowledge of information can face prosecution under this act, as can an individual who deliberately ignored the information or acted in reckless disregard. As a result, the government can prosecute a False Claims Act in instances where there is not a specific intent to defraud. Violations of the False Claims Act can result in some very serious penalties and recoveries of funds. The government may require the provider to pay back false claims at up to 3 times the amount of disallowed claim and can impose penalties of $5,500 to $11,000 per claim that was submitted for payment. Under the False Claims Act, a provider or an individual can be criminally prosecuted. There are many cases where individual providers were criminally prosecuted. There are also specific cases where an individual, frequently an employee, faced criminal prosecution for knowingly causing a false claim to be submitted. New York State enacted its own False Claims Act in 2007. It closely tracks the federal False Claims Act. Under New York State's False Claims Act, it is illegal for one to submit a claim to the state government that you know or should have known is false. There are also severe penalties for violations of the New York False Claims Act. Fines of up to $12,000 per claim may be imposed, as well as double or triple damages. Receiving funds for goods or services that were not actually provided may be considered fraud. This can occur when a person documents for something that they did not provide and we receive payment for the service. This can also occur when documentation is false, inaccurate, or inadequately completed. In most programs, services are authorized based on a person's need. The authorization for the type, amount, and frequency of services is stated in the form of a plan, such as a treatment plan, a service plan, a care plan, a prescription, or order by a physician. It may be considered fraud when services are billed in excess of the amount authorized or not medically necessary. In some programs, the person providing service must meet certain educational requirements or possess a current license for their profession. It is considered fraud when an unqualified or unlicensed person provides services that are billed to Medicaid or Medicare. We have developed policies and procedures to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. It is up to every employee to comply with these policies and procedures and standards of practice. The government does acknowledge innocent errors, that we are human and mistakes can occur. For the government to prosecute under the False Claims Act, there must be a criminal intent to defraud. In these cases, there are criminal penalties, which may include fines, restitution, and possible jail time. Civil penalties may be imposed in cases where an individual or entity had knowledge of a false claim, and in cases where information about a false claim was disregarded or deliberately ignored. In order to encourage individuals to come forward and report misconduct involving false claims, the False Claims Act contains a qui tam, or whistleblower provision. The whistleblower provisions are part of the federal and New York False Claims Act. Private citizens are able to bring suits under the False Claims Act in the name of the government. If the case is successfully prosecuted, the relator shares in the government's recovery. There is a protection under this law for the relator or whistleblower that prohibits retaliation against the person who reported. This is referred to as a whistleblower protection. The False Claims Act prohibits discrimination against any employee for taking lawful actions under the False Claims Act. Our compliance program establishes a procedure for reporting compliance concerns and strictly prohibits retaliation against an employee who raises a compliance concern in good faith. The New York State Office of Medicaid Inspector General, or OMIG, is the first Office of Medicaid Inspector General in the nation. Its purpose is to coordinate the detection and prevention of Medicaid fraud, waste, and abuse. The OMIG is responsible for audits of Medicaid providers. These can be in the form of targeted review audits, desk audits where a provider sends the supporting documentation for claims under review, or field audits. As part of healthcare reform, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was signed into law in March of 2010. The False Claims Act was again updated as part of this legislation. It is now mandatory that repayments are made for billing errors or irregularities and for instances in which a provider received healthcare funds they were not entitled to. The repayment must occur within 60 days from which it was identified, or the provider can be civilly or criminally prosecuted under the False Claims Act. There are protections and safeguards against the submission of false claims or errors and omissions. Training is one of the most important preventative measures. Employees need to know how to do their jobs correctly and be familiar with and follow applicable policies and procedures addressing laws and regulations. We must assure that we hire and retain qualified staff. We must also assure that the credentials, education, experience, and any special licensing requirements are verified and that all staff meet any minimum qualifications for the positions they hold. It is important that there are open lines of communication between program staff, management, and billing or finance staff. There must be sufficient internal controls and processes to assure that all services are authorized, medically necessary, and reviewed for effectiveness and continued need. Procedures must address the delivery and documentation of services, how services are billed, and how governmental funds are used. We must also audit and monitor our programs and services to ensure that we comply with laws and regulations and our own policies and procedures. These actions form the basis of our compliance program.
I believe the best way to describe compliance on a personal level is it's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, even when no one is watching. On an organizational level, compliance means that you as an organization conduct business in ways that promote people doing the right thing and complying with the laws and the regulations. Compliance means, as an organization, that you continually monitor yourself to assure that you are complying with the laws and the regulations. Compliance means that you have systems in place as an organization to respond as a whole organization when there are changes, whether they be regulations, changes in the regulatory environment, or the results of a report, an audit, an internal review, or an issue of noncompliance.
For our county, it means we are committed to making sure that we provide high-quality services with the highest degree of integrity and always act in an ethical manner. Compliance needs to be an integral part of our culture. In 2009, New York State adopted the New York State Codes, Rules, and Regulations, Title 18, Part 521 Regulation, which requires the adoption of an effective compliance program. The regulations state that the compliance program must be applicable to billings and payments, medical necessity and quality of care, governance, mandatory reporting, credentialing, and other risk areas that are, or with due diligence, identified by the provider. The regulations define the mandatory elements of a compliance program. The first element includes written policies and procedures. These are developed from the laws and regulations and provide employees with written guidance on how to perform their job responsibilities. A code of conduct is part of the written documents that guide employees in their day-to-day actions and performance of their job. It is important that you are familiar with our code of conduct and policies and procedures. Our code of conduct is a very important element of our compliance program. In addition to following our policies and procedures, you are expected to adhere to a code of conduct. When you are faced with a situation that is not addressed by policies and procedures or the code of conduct, or seems to conflict, you are expected to seek direction from a member of management. Compliance oversight is the second required element of a compliance program. The compliance officer is responsible for the compliance program. The compliance officer works with a compliance committee to assure that we have an effective compliance program and effective methods to report compliance-related issues. The third element is education and training. The training in compliance starts with the governing body and continues to all levels of the organization. This is required training for new employees and will be held on a regular basis to provide refreshers to existing employees. Additional training or department-specific training should occur as risks are identified, with changes in laws and regulations, and on an as-needed basis. The fourth element requires having a method for effective confidential communication and is essential to our compliance program. Employees, contractors, agents, and other interested parties must have a means to ask questions, seek clarification, or report suspected instances of noncompliance with regulations and policies and procedures without fear of retaliation or job threat. The fifth element of a compliance program is the enforcement of its standards, policies, and procedures. Our policy for performance management and disciplinary action addresses what will happen when someone does not follow our standards, policies, and procedures. It is important for you to understand that a failure to report actual or suspected noncompliance or violations of our compliance plan may also result in disciplinary action. The sixth element identifies systems and processes by which we will audit and monitor ourselves to assure we are complying with all laws and regulations. We conduct audits of our programs and operations to determine if we are in compliance with the laws, regulations, and our own established policies and procedures. The results of audits are communicated to management, the compliance committee, and the governing body. The seventh element details how we will respond when there is a finding either through a complaint, an internal audit, or an audit by an oversight agency. A plan of correction is developed, reviewed by the compliance officer and committee, and monitored for completeness and effectiveness. The eighth and last element of our compliance program includes a policy prohibiting any intimidation or retaliation when an employee, in good faith, reports suspected or actual non-compliance with laws, regulations, or our policies and procedures. To summarize, it is your responsibility as an employee, contractor, or agent to attend required trainings and read and be familiar with our compliance plan and the code of conduct. We expect that you comply with all applicable laws, regulations, policies, procedures, and standards of practice. It is important that you promptly report any issues, concerns, or possible violations of our compliance plan or code of conduct. If you have any questions about the material covered by this presentation, please direct them to your supervisor, a member of the management staff, or the compliance officer.